Maybe you heard the rumor that some high schools in the United States were giving students who identified as furries litter boxes to use instead of normal toilets.
It's described to me that we have kids in our schools that believe that they are animals. And they are identifying, I'm told, as animals. Identifying as animals. They think they're a cat. A cat. They put tails on and they demand that they have a litter box in the school.
I really love playing this character, and he is a character. I'm performing when I'm dressed as him. So I feel like someone else in the sense that I'm playing a part.
So, what is a furry? According to some misinformed people, a furry is someone who thinks they're an animal. But the vast majority of people would infer from the definition on Google that a furry is somebody who likes anthropomorphic characters and may be a fursuiter or use an original character to represent themselves differently online. However, not many people would notice that what I just said has several issues. Just to name a few, it doesn't differentiate between a fanbase and a fandom. It also doesn't account for what people may call furries as characters in cartoons, and it fails to describe the furry fandom adequately, as it appears to be attempting to do. Before this gets any more confusing, let me get into the main part of the video and tell you why the definition of furry is wrong. Right now, if you heard the word furry out of context, I'm fairly certain that you would probably think about the furry fandom, or an anthropomorphic animal, creature, or something similar. It wasn't always this way though. Before 1995, when the term furry began to be related to the furry fandom, it simply referred to anything that was made of fur or covered with fur, similar to how a few people still use the word today as a substitute for fluffy. However, over time as the furry fandom got more popular, the word furry began to be used as a slang term to describe a person who is part of the furry fandom, and less as a way to describe an anthropomorphic furry character. The issue is that people mistook what the common interest of the furry fandom is, liking anthropomorphic animals, and applied it to the broad definition behind the word furry, which is inaccurate because a person who has an interest in these characters is not necessarily part of the fandom. Anyway, there are a few important things that you have to know before I discuss these issues any further, because they are fundamental to understanding how a definition is made. You have to know the difference between objects, subjects, and relationships. The first of these is objects, which can be split into two categories. Material, referring to things in our world around us that exist independently from ourselves, and ideal, referring to abstract concepts such as communities or gods. An example of material objects could be chairs. We define it as an individual seat with 4 legs and typically a back. I can see and touch chairs, and I also know that they are a thing that will continue to exist. The second of these is subjects, which can explain particular things within groups of objects. Bringing back this chair, I could describe this as an old-looking chair made of wood with beige upholstery. That would be a subject of chairs. The third and final one of these is relationships, which explain the links connecting two or more objects of any kind. For example, to make this wonderful chair, I would need to harvest wood, which I would do with this tool against this tree. So the link between the two objects, if I were to call myself a woodcutter, would be the tool as it links myself and the tree. Hopefully that was a good enough description for you of those 3 factors, so that you can understand that if we relate it to the furry fandom, you can see how the definition of furries was made. But here comes the part where things start to get bad again. As I said earlier, the definition of furry in terms of the furry fandom does not account for the differences between a fan base, specifically people who have an interest in something but don't identify with a group, and a fandom, specifically a group of people with a shared common interest that identify with a common group. So we end up with a case where people are being labeled as part of the furry fandom when they are actually part of a completely different group or not part of a group at all. all, and maybe just like anthropomorphic animals, such as in this case. For example, some Disney characters who will remain unnamed. This is an issue because people end up being worried about showing off their hobbies and interests due to the public's negative perception of the furry fandom, so much to the point where some people get aggressive in attempting to defend themselves as a person who isn't part of the furry fandom. Now, some of you may remember that I talked about the use of the word furry and how it has changed over time, especially to the point where most people hear the word out of context and immediately think of the furry fandom. Well, this is because of a shift between a universalist to a differentialist definition, as Ader calls it in their incredible essay. Originally, the definition of furry would generally be agreed to be any object or relationship related to anthropomorphic animals, which is objective, not leaving anything up to assumption. However, as the fandom grew and the issue of association with the community unintentionally rose, the definition shifted to a more subjective differentialist approach, where all objects and relationships that have a link to the furry fandom are considered furry, essentially consciously linked to a fandom identity. Yet, not everyone adopts this definition, which is why there is still confusion and sometimes heated debates. Universalists would argue that the definition limits creative freedom, but differentialists would argue that using such a broad definition comes with the risk of appropriating content from other fandoms, but also has the issue of leaving too much up to subjectivity, which may confuse people who, for example, see art that looks furry-like but isn't tied to the fandom and therefore isn't furry related. I'm sure you can see how confusing all of this is. What is worse is that most people by 2023 began using a dual definition, which takes in both of these approaches and causes a lot of confusion both inside and outside of the fandom on what a furry is, what art is furry art, and what characters are furry related. This is also unfortunately another negative aspect, which leads to many heated debates among various people and further puts the furry fandom into a negative light at some points when people reference the drama of the fandom. Instead of being so general, it is suggested that new definitions are imposed. One being a furry fan who likes the idea of animals having human personalities or an anthropomorphic shape, and another being a toon fan who likes cartoons but isn't drawn by the fact that an anthropomorphic character is an animal, but instead is drawn generally by the like of the character. Honestly, I don't know what the best option would be to rework the definition to better represent what furry means, but this could be a step in the right direction. What do you think? Let me know in the comments or in my Discord server at dsc.gg/skykes. And with that, I hope you all have a fantastic day.